Have you ever considered the man behind the ceremonial uniform? The air at Windsor Castle that morning held an unseasonable chill. Guardsman Thomas Ashton, stood at my post. My scarlet uniform was a stark contrast against the ancient stone walls. 8 years of military service etched themselves into my posture. The first hint of trouble was the distant growl of a motorcycle engine, not the buzzing of tourist rentals, but the predatory rumble of a modified machine. The sound grew, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. My combat-trained senses registered the approaching threat. The motorcycle, pulling up to the curb, was as dark as its rider's intentions. Chrome skulls adorned the handlebars, and Norse runes, symbols of dark ideology, were emblazoned on the fuel tank. The rider, a hulking man in a leather vest that strained to contain his bulk, dismounted slowly. Steel-toed boots crunched on the pavement. Patches on his vest bore symbols that had chilled spines since the 1940s. A crude iron cross hung around his neck, a cheap imitation that spoke of stolen valor and twisted ideals, not military honor. Well, the biker grunted. Look what we have here. He swaggered towards my post. Standing pretty in your fancy uniform. The crowd shifted uneasy. Parents drew their children back. Elderly visitors watched the biker with apprehension. You know what I see when I look at you. The biker circled me. Everything that's wrong with this world. All this tradition and order, it makes me sick. I remained motionless. My discipline had been forged in dangerous places. Eyes steady, every muscle alert. Years of service had taught me to read threats. The biker stepped closer, reeking of leather and malice. Fingers adorned with hate symbol rings flexed. You lot, always hiding behind uniforms, he sneered. Afraid to face real men. The morning sun glinted off my brass buttons. Mirror bright, they had saved lives in conflict zones. Places where I'd earned the right to wear this uniform. The biker's reflection warped in the buttons. Hey, toy soldier, the biker barked. I'm talking to you. He crowded closer, invading my space. His bulk cast a shadow over my boots. German tourists ushered their children away. The biker grinned. Look at that. Folks still know to run when they see the likes of us. His laugh was ugly, an echo of dark ideologies. Morning sun caught the iron cross. Illicit patches strained on his vest. But you'll just stand there, won't you? All discipline and protocol. He spat the words. A Royal Marine veteran stepped forward, face hardening. But before he could speak, the biker rounded on him. Stay out of it, old man. Your generation had your chance. My eyes remained fixed, but my senses tracked every movement. Afghanistan and Iraq had taught me to read the signs of violence. The biker was broadcasting them all. You know what your problem is? The biker resumed circling. You're part of the system that's softening everyone up, all these rules, ceremony, while real men are out here living free. His voice echoed in the courtyard. Tourists had stopped to watch. Some recoiled, others stood frozen. I watch you, the biker continued, day in, day out, standing here in your soldier suit, while the world laughs. He jabbed a finger at one of the hate runes. My granddad told me about real strength, times when men didn't hide behind uniforms. My stance remained perfect. My rifle was not ceremonial, but a tool I'd use in combat. Cat got your tongue? The biker loomed closer, breath fogging my buttons. Of course not. You're just a puppet. What are you even protecting here? Fancy buildings, outdated traditions. A child tugged at his mother's coat. Mommy, why is that man angry? The question seemed to fuel the biker's rage. Why am I angry? He roared. Because society worships this, these toy soldiers, defenders of weakness, while real men uphold the old ways. The biker moved fast. Leather vest creaked, chains jingled. Let's see how tough your protocol is, he snarled. His massive hand slammed into my chest, sending me staggering back. The blow carried the weight of bar fights. My boots scraped on the stone, balance faltering. For a heartbeat, my stance wavered, rifle tilting. Sunlight flashed on my buttons. Then I was on the ground. My rifle clattered on the stones. The biker's laughter boomed. "There's your glorious protector." He threw his arms wide. Combat tattoos rippled. "Not looking so perfect now, are you?" Tourists gasped. A child began to cry. The veteran stepped forward again. "This is what happens," the biker declared to the crowd. "This is what you get when you believe in weakness, in tradition. Real power doesn't bow to protocol. Real men don't hide behind ceremony." 3 seconds I lay on the ground, my rifle beside me. My eyes were no longer ceremonial. They had seen combat. They locked onto the biker, focused like a predator. "Hail victory!" the biker yelled, turning his back. The iron cross swung, a taunt of past glories. "See how your protector falls, how tradition crumbles." But he'd made a mistake. He'd mistaken protocol for weakness, discipline for subservience. Hubris had blinded him. He'd turned his back on a soldier who had earned his uniform in combat. My eyes locked on the biker's back. White-gloved hands pressed against the stones. Combat training took over from ceremony. Every finger found its tactical position. In that moment, I represented every soldier who had ever fought. Muscles coiled, battlefield experience calculated angles. The biker was still basking in his triumph, blind to what was coming. Arms raised, mouth open, I moved with battlefield efficiency. Sunlight blazed on my buttons. I moved like a predator. My rise wasn't ceremonial, but pure combat efficiency. Every muscle trained. Before the biker's taunt died, my hand clamped onto his shoulder. Grip tactically perfect. Fingers found pressure points. Raw pain shattered his triumph. Hip strike deployed. The biker flew, then slammed into the ground. The iron cross shattered, but it wasn't over. My boot slammed onto his chest, securing control, toe cap gleaming. "Go on," I said. "Test your real power now." My foot maintained pressure. The biker struggled, utterly pinned, face contorted with rage and disbelief, arms straining, but my stance was perfect. Can't move, can you? Funny, isn't it? All that hate, all that power, useless against training. My boots shifted, finding another pressure point. Let me tell you about real power. The crowd was silent. The veteran nodded, grim-faced. This uniform isn't about ceremony. It's about discipline control. Things men like you fear. My boot maintained pressure. I fought men like you in Afghanistan. Real power isn't about intimidation. It's about control, discipline. The biker choked, trying to speak. You're a part. Part of what? The weakness? While you were terrorizing bars, I was learning combat in war zones. While you were collecting hate symbols, I was earning medals defending freedom. My boot maintained control. The power you think you have, we use it to protect people from men like you. The biker's face was turning purple. You can't do this. Actually, I can. You assaulted a queen's guard. You forfeited the right to civility. I'm using a fraction of the authority I have. You disrespected the uniform. In World War II, this uniform stood against men like you. Your kind marched across Europe, thought they were the embodiment of strength. They learned as you're learning. Real power isn't intimidation, isn't hate. It's discipline, training, and the will to stand against men like you. You don't understand, the biker gasped. We're the real men, the strong ones. Let me tell you about real strength. I've fought in places you can't find on a map. This uniform represents everything that stopped your kind 70 years ago. Every button, every medal. The triumph of discipline over savagery. Real power is standing watch for hours, maintaining discipline, representing tradition, and having the power to break you, but choosing not to. That's the difference between us. The biker's bluster had deflated. Look around you. These walls have stood against stronger men than you. This uniform has protected kings, queens. Discipline keeps you in check. The veteran stepped closer. Served in Northern Ireland. Dealt with men who thought violence was power. Real power is serving something greater than yourself. My boot remained steady. Here's what's going to happen. Police are coming. You'll be charged with assaulting a queen's guard. When you look in the mirror, remember this moment. Remember how real discipline trumps the symbols of hate. Sirens wailed closer. Police arrived. Assault on a queen's guard. Serious offense, sir. Officers took control. With perfect tactical disengagement, I removed my boot. Police hauled the biker to his feet. You'll regret this. The biker spat. My brothers. Your brothers? Let them test their strength against real training. My eyes locked on the bikers. We'll be here. The biker was led away, sputtering with impotent rage. His patches looked pathetic now. I retrieved my rifle, checked it, returned to my post. My uniform was unruffled. The veteran approached. Royal Marines, 82 to 95. Standards haven't slipped. He offered a crisp salute. I returned it. 2 soldiers, generations apart, but understanding the meaning of a uniform. The crowd dispersed, silent. Parents explained real strength to their children. The German tourists looked relieved. A biker patch lay discarded on the ground. A street sweeper collected it. The day moved on. Tourists came and went. But those who had witnessed it had seen a truth, the steel beneath the uniform. I resumed my watch. Stance perfect, focus absolute. But now I was more than just a guardsman. I was a lesson learned in combat, reinforced in London. What makes the uniform more than cloth and brass? Tradition, character? Perhaps both. Historical respect and present-day resolve. Ready to stand against those who mistake ceremony for weakness. When you see a queen's guard, remember the combat training beneath. Those who mistake their discipline for weakness do so at their peril. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe. True respect is earned. Those who uphold our traditions represent something greater than themselves. Silence carries the loudest message. Those who mistake silence for weakness learn the hardest lessons.